The third possibility is if the war were to go on for a longer time and the war engulfs Russia in it, and so do the Western powers, the US and the others, get engulfed in Europe, it leaves China with a free run in Indo-Pacific to possibly undertake its campaigns and deploy its plans in the region. So that's a third possibility. Whether it's possible or not, we'll see. One of the outcomes that emerges out of this is that as the war focuses on Europe, there are certain areas, certain red flags that become even more and more pronounced in the region. One of the areas is the question of Taiwan. Good morning to all of you, and I hope we have an engrossing next 40 minutes, after which I would I would request you to ask me the questions that you have. As Rahul said, we have had a lot of newsprint and media uh, and a lot of news about the war that is going on, the war in Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine war. We have been reading it in the news, in media, in print, and on television all the time for the last couple of months. The one thing that we wanted to highlight here, and that's where when I was speaking with Aparna earlier at Sangam Talks, I mentioned that there is a lot that is going to happen in Indo-Pacific, which is actually the region where uh, the the impact or the consequences of the current war will finally be seen. As they say, this is what we mean by the Indo-Pacific region. And though geographically this would constitute the Indo-Pacific, which is the Indian Ocean, the region around it, the South China Sea, as you can see, it extends to the East China Sea, and the Eastern Asian region. It also extends up to Australia in the southern hemisphere, and the Horn of Africa to the west. So this is the Indo-Pacific region geographically. But if we were to look at it from a political angle, it is a region that is influenced by the interest of a major power in the region, which is China. It is in two respects. One is the rise of China in the region and the relative decline of American influence in the region. And that's what defines the geopolitical importance of Indo-Pacific. I will come to what else, why do we talk about Indo-Pacific, and why should we talk about Indo-Pacific in the light of the of the Russia-Ukraine war that is currently underway. So let me start with the war a little bit, just to set the context. We have been talking about the war. We have been talking about the casualties, the movement of Russia, and why Russia has got stuck. Has it succeeded? Has it not? A lot of questions, a lot of discussions have arisen out of the war. I would touch upon the genesis of it, and I will come back to the genesis of Indo-Pacific and connect it there. Why do we talk about the genesis? Because that's what defines the past, defines the history, defines the present, and what's going to happen in the future. When we talk about the Ukraine war, let's go back a point in time to a point in time in history. I like to embellish all talks and writings with stories and cases, because that's what enables us to recall events in better and have a better understanding. The story starts in 1989. That was the time the Berlin Wall fell. We all are aware of that year that the Berlin Wall fell. After the Berlin Wall fell, a few months later, in Dresden, at Stasi headquarters, which was the East German secret police headquarters, a crowd gathered and they protested violently, ran through the Stasi headquarters, the East German secret police headquarters, destroyed it, and left it in tatters. Opposite the street, there was a KGB office. They went to the KGB office and protested loudly in front of the office, threatening to ransack the office. A young man stepped out from that KGB office, told the violent crowd that his men were armed and going to fire at the crowd. He bluffed. For a moment, the crowd waited, wanted to understand if the man was true to what he was saying. But the man said, look, you can't do this against the KGB headquarters, KGB office here in Dresden. We're going to open fire and we're going to kill you. The crowd stopped. The man then called up his Russian headquarters and asked for protection. The answer from the Russian headquarters, local Russian headquarters, was that we are awaiting orders from Moscow. The orders from Moscow never arrived. Luckily, the crowd went away after a while. But the imprint that the incident had on the young man who had stepped out and threatened the crowd and had asked for help but had got no help from Moscow would leave a deep impression in the events to follow. That event, that day, started a journey in the young man's life. Humiliated and lost, he went back to Moscow after his posting in Dresden was abruptly over. That man was Vladimir Putin. That day, he started his journey of restoring Russia's pride. For right or for wrong, his understanding of history, Vladimir Putin's understanding of history, is deeply rooted in the postscript of the Cold War, which is basically which has a rise of the US as a sole superpower on one side, combined with the decline of Russia as a superpower. But he had it in his mind that over the years, as he rose through the ranks, he wanted to deploy his ambition at some point of time in the course of his political journey. Over a period of time, he became an authoritarian leader, and in 2008, much later, Putin and Russia attacked Georgia. He realized that the US and the NATO forces could not do much. 2014, he again attacked Crimea, but nothing happened because the US and the NATO forces did not have much of teeth to actually oppose Putin's invasion. In 2021, by 2021, he had also got an ally in China, which was also a very strong power in the world arena by now. So 2021, he amassed troops outside on the borders of Ukraine, and then he launched the invasion of Ukraine. True to form, the US and the NATO forces could not intervene. Now, this is a context, how the journey of an authoritarian leader or an authoritarian dictator is rooted in the circumstances of history where he finds relief. And that's how Putin started his journey. When we talk about the impact in Indo-Pacific, why and how it's going to impact the Indo-Pacific. Now, as I said, Putin has a very strong ally in China. China was deeply interested in the war. On the sidelines of the Olympics, China and Russia inked a pact wherein, interestingly, China supported Russia against the NATO's expansion. Over the years, Putin's insecurities were also, buffeted or, sort of found where it found validation was the expansion of NATO towards Russia's borders. So China supported Russia's stand against NATO, and they inked a pact. In return, Russia supported China's claims over Taiwan, and this is January 2022. A month later, when Russia attacked, China remained non-committal. There were three possibilities that China, because as I say, the impact, the consequences, the impact of the war would be in Indo-Pacific. So China was interested in there were three consequences of the war. One, if the war would have finished in 72 to 96 hours, which Vladimir Putin thought it would. They would overwhelm and overrun Ukraine. But that did not happen. The second, if that had happened, it would have resulted in two things. One, the overwhelming superiority of war machines that Russia had, and the superiority of the military strategy and tactics that Russia would deploy in the battleground. The decline of the US was the other consequence that would have happened completely. And the third would have been the increase in influence of China as a superpower in the world. But that did not happen. Ukraine did not fold in 72 to 96 hours. So the second consequence, or the second possibility, was that Ukraine continues to fight, which it did and which it does. And Russia has had, the war has not gone in line with Putin's plans. And as the war unfolded, Putin's plans seemed to grow by the hour, grow by the day. And that made China uncomfortable. Because what had happened as the war progressed is that Russia became weaker as an ally. As Russia became weaker as an ally, China also, understood the fact that they had got played into the whole thing. I would also say that, there's a third option, there's a third possibility is not often spoken about. The third possibility is if the war were to go on for a longer time and the war engulfs Russia in it, and so do the Western powers, the US and the others, get engulfed in Europe, it leaves China with a free run in Indo-Pacific to possibly undertake its campaigns and deploy its plans in the region. So that's a third possibility. Whether it's possible or not, we'll see. One of the outcomes that emerges out of this is that, as the war focuses on Europe, there are certain areas, certain red flags that become even more and more pronounced in the region. One of the areas is the question of Taiwan. Let us understand, when Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, one of the ambitions of Xi Jinping was to become a greater leader than Mao Zedong, perhaps the greatest leader that China would have ever produced. To do that, one of the first things that Xi Jinping laid out, or one of the consistent points that he's laid out, is the reunification of Taiwan with China. Is a stronger China, is a China that has got a stronger naval influence across the world. To do that, the ability to demonstrate how strong, how influential China is, can only be done by that one action which Xi Jinping hopes would happen one day, which is the unification of Taiwan. Is that going to happen? Is that possible? Is Ukraine similar to Taiwan, or is Taiwan, as helpless as Ukraine? When we look at Taiwan, and we'll look at a few things in Indo-Pacific, there are red flags here. Taiwan has, if you look at Taiwan has relations with only a handful of countries, whereas Ukraine had a relationship with 180 countries across the world. When we look at Taiwan, the other factor that comes about is that, unlike Ukraine, Taiwan has had a long history of economic, political, and strategic relationship with the West, with the United States. We say, and it is often said, that the US failed in protecting, or failed in Afghanistan insofar as protecting its interests. The US failed in protecting Ukraine, which it sought to protect at some point of time, and egged on in the war against Russia. So if that has happened, will the US fail again in Taiwan, is a question that is often asked, because that will actually finish the American influence, the American hegemony as a superpower in the world, and signal the rise of China. Will that happen? The question is therefore, I mean, I would answer it differently. Taiwan is a major economic power, unlike Ukraine, in the sense that today, in a digitized world, it holds 92% of the semiconductor market. Now, why the semiconductor chips are important? As the IT industry grows, as the Chinese IT industry grows, as the world automobile industry grows, the requirement of semiconductor chips in the manufacture of all these items and every other thing is extremely important. Without these semiconductor chips being supplied by Taiwan, the world will not progress, the world will not function, the economy of the world will suffer a huge disaster. Taiwan holds 92% of that market. The rest 8% is held disparately, mostly by South Korea. So, one is that. The second, and how has it grown? How has it grown to have such a huge influence on the world global semiconductor chip market? Is because over the years it has got integrated with the US in terms of its business, in terms of its economy. Taiwan is US's fifth largest good trading partner. I don't have the numbers in terms of what is the. I think it's about $90 billion. It's a huge. It's the fifth largest trading partner in the world. Uh, so when you talk about artificial intelligence, when you talk about Google, when you talk about the various US companies, Amazon, Facebook, none of them would want the Taiwan economy to collapse, because that will signal the collapse of US corporate hegemony. So if you see, the business interests in Taiwan, in Ukraine, were not predominant enough, were not strong enough for the Americans or the West to really intervene there. Afghanistan, it's a no-brainer. When we talk about Taiwan, the business interests, the economic interests actually override a lot of other interests. And that would be a significant determinant in ensuring that Taiwan is no easy invasion for China. And it's not a template, unlike unlike Ukraine was for Russia. China thought that the Ukraine Russia the war would be a template for China's invasion of Taiwan if that had finished quickly. Now that has not. Ukraine has stood up. Uh, yes, of course, with help from the Western powers. But here there is a completely different kind of a template, given the fact that Taiwan is connected economically with the rest of the world. The second thing that I want to bring out here is that if you look at China, and this is from a military point of view, China has been the master of posturing. China has never fought a successful campaign since 1979, when it went to Vietnam and went there and it launched a war in Vietnam with disastrous consequences. So China has not had a successful campaign. The last successful campaign China had was in the 50s and in the 60s, in 1962 against India. After that, it had had a defeat against India in 1967, which I spoke about, which I've written about in my book Watershed, 1967. And 1979, it suffered against Vietnam as well. We must also understand a very lesser known battle that took place between China and Taiwan in 1958, which we don't speak about. Chinese planes flew over Taiwan wanting to capture Taiwan. And those were the days when China wanted to, and Mao Zedong was on a high, was marching ahead. Chiang Kai-shek was on the defensive. He was a Taiwanese leader. But despite the fact that they had an overwhelming superiority at that point of time, they could not capture Taiwan. And in 1958, though they had the better of the exchanges, Taiwan asked for American assistance and actually fought off the Chinese Air Force with lesser number of planes. But that was a very limited skirmish that had happened in 1958. So China is wary. Chinese planners do not go to war if they're not very sure that they would actually succeed in that. And that is where I feel China's ambitions on Taiwan comes unstuck. So what happens to Xi Jinping? Xi Jinping has been talking about the unification of Taiwan. So we talk about the options of China on Taiwan and what is going to happen in that region. So we talk about whether China is going to invade Taiwan. There are people who say yes, there are people who say no. Then I don't think China is going to outrightly invade Taiwan in the recent future, in the current future. Maybe in the long term, we don't know. The second option is whether China is not going to invade Taiwan. I don't think that is possible as well. I mean, I don't think China is going to sit back and not invade Taiwan. So what is the outcome then? If they're not going to invade, or if they're going to launch an invasion, if both these options of launching an invasion and not launching an invasion are not true, what could be the third option? And that's where I believe that the Chinese way of looking at it, or here in Asia, we ought to look at things from an Asian template and not from a Western template, which is where China has been. The West believes believes in an invasion, or in the second option of a country not invading. I would think the Chinese, the way they have gone about in the last 40-45 years, as I said, China has not launched an invasion since 1979. But China has always believed in salami slicing, has always believed in nibbling, putting, the 9-dash line, where they have made artificial islands and have, claimed the sea, the nautical miles around it, which is allowed by the UN UNOCLOS, the United Nations Council on Land and Sea. So China has always believed in nibbling away, which is what is being described often as salami slicing. So what would China do as far as Taiwan? In 1958, China tried to attack the Kinmen Islands. You see, the Kinmen Islands not very far away from the Chinese coast. Yet, they today are still with Taiwan. And as the war was about to begin in Ukraine in February, very few people know that Chinese planes, there were 21 fighter jets that flew over Taiwan and actually made Taiwan scramble its fighter jets. The reason why it flew over Taiwan at that point of time in January, end of January, was to see what is the reaction. And soon enough, a few weeks later, Russia invaded Ukraine. The war started. China was testing the waters as to what would happen. The war in Ukraine has not gone as far as China's plans or China's thoughts would have been, or as China would have liked. And now, the third option which I talk about as to what would China do in the case of Taiwan, is to look at the smaller islands, the Penghu Islands, or we don't see it in the map. There are certain islands south of Taiwan which they would want to take on, block the trade routes of Taiwan, put pressure on Taiwan by nibbling away into islands that are far away from the mainland of Taiwan, and hope that the United States does not interfere, because you can always say that we have not attacked the mainland of Taiwan, but we are only claiming some of these islands which are around Taiwan, which is a midway, which is a sort of a middle path that China might want to take on, squeeze Taiwan economically, nibble away at the islands, and hope at some point of time they're able to launch their ultimate invasion, which is what I believe is perhaps the Chinese theory insofar as Taiwan is concerned, given their history of nibbling away, given their history of salami slicing, and given their history of not being able to deploy a full-fledged invasion successfully for almost half a century. That, I believe, is what China would possibly do. But it is also quite clear that unlike Ukraine, where the European powers haven't been able to really move and prevent a war, in this case, what happens is that geographically, if China were to launch an aggression against Taiwan, it violates the Japanese airspace. So when this happened, when the Chinese fighter jets went in January this year, they actually disturbed the Japanese airspace, and that provoked Japan. Shinzo Abe, no less, former president, he said that Japan should obtain a security guarantee from the US and should rethink its nuclear plans. Now that split opinion in Japan. I don't want to go into the Second World War, but post the Second World War, Japanese military expansion had been kept in check given the Japanese role in the Second World War. But now Japan and thinkers in Japan, presidents in Japan have started to outline, have started to express that time has come to give it a rethink in the light of the rise of the rise of China in the region, and so that kind of enables us to understand the entire Taiwan conundrum in the light of the fact that Taiwan is a small area which is also surrounded by other airspaces and other countries which could feel threatened. The consequence of capture of Taiwan also threatens the entire region because it's not just Taiwan. Japan and Korea feel threatened because Taiwan proves to be a staging ground for China to launch the next phase of an attack, a possible attack on Japan, and they wouldn't wait for that to happen. So there is a whole lot of it's a domino effect in terms of Indo-Pacific, in terms of China's ambitions, and as I said, Indo-Pacific is largely, as we speak today, in geopolitical terms, it's governed by the centrality of China's interests and China's rise in the region, and the fact that the others in the region, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, whether it's India, are all wary of it. They're all aware and wary of it. In Europe, the move of Russia into Ukraine was again may not have threatened the entire world order, but in this case, it does. And that is why the other countries, and you see this happening in recent times, India has had a pact with France, India has moved closer to France, to Australia. There is a lot of movement happening here. And it is also an outcome of a realization that America, for all its influence in the past, may not have that kind of an influence anymore. So therefore, you have a Quad and you have important countries in the region getting together, hobnobbing, and identifying if there are common interests that they can bank on. What we understand, therefore, is that the unintended consequences of a war in today's world are underwritten by its executors. So if it has happened in Europe, it has happened in Ukraine and Russia, it's been underwritten by its executors, whether it's Russia, whether it is China, or whether it is US by its expansion of the NATO expansion in the region, Russia by its ambitions, and China by looking at it as a template for Indo-Pacific. And the outcome of that war can steer other wars or other conflicts in a region far away, which is Indo-Pacific. How does, so when we talk about this entire, and we spoke about Taiwan, we can't cover a lot in 40 minutes. So I chose Taiwan because I thought that is an important area which will come to be highlighted as we go along. But as far as India is concerned, given the fact that India is a major ally of the larger forces, the other forces, as I would call it, the Western forces, the US, and the European forces against the rise of China, it is important to note that India's value and India's central position in this region is absolutely crucial. It is understood by the West. It is also understood by China. And that's precisely the reason why India also faces a threat. We saw it in the Himalayan region last year before last. We have seen it in the Indian Ocean region, where there has been a constant jostling for influence. I call it surrogate conflict between India and China. What used to happen earlier between the US and the USSR long back. In this region, these are China may be a potential global power. It is a global power. India is certainly a very strong regional power, which China is wary of. So China and India engage in some ways in a surrogate conflict. And that surrogate conflict sees the impact in Maldives, sees the impact in Sri Lanka, where China wants to acquire an important port, Hambantota port, China's influence in Nepal, China wants to influence Bhutan. So, and Myanmar both jostle for influence. So, this is a surrogate influence where China understands that it cannot push India, it cannot push India back in the Himalayas. It might as well want to acquire more influence in the region, in the Indian Ocean region, which is a part of the Indo-Pacific as well. So this is a second point. We've seen recently the economic failure of Sri Lanka, the political failure of Pakistan. Now these are outcomes of the loan diplomacy, the creditor diplomacy that China has been undertaking. Yes, a lot of people spoke about how BRI is going to be very, very important and it's going to be a major trade route. But most of the, about 60, I don't have the percentage, about 60% or 65% of these countries that China has been in, has given loans to, or who are a part of this entire BRI project, do not have the means to repay the money. And they will all be engulfed in the bankruptcy trap that they will finally find themselves in. And what then happens is there is a huge backlash within the country. We find that in Sri Lanka today. We are finding it in Pakistan in certain senses. We saw the killing of, we read about, and I guess you would have read about the killing of Chinese engineers in Pakistan recently. So there is a backlash that builds up when your country is unable to sustain itself economically because of certain debt traps that they enter into, and that is going to happen over a period of time. We also see that BRI. So China wanted access to European markets, and it was banking on using the old Russian railway route in Europe and the infrastructure, which has all got dismantled and disturbed by the war, the Ukraine, the entire the infrastructure that links it to the European markets. So there is going to be the impact of the war in Indo-Pacific and in the interests of Indo-Pacific or China with the other parts of the world. Thirdly, I would come to India, and I think we would wrap up with this. Now, what India has had a very India is perhaps one of the very few nations that took a very nuanced stand. Everybody either jumped on the US bandwagon in the light of the war, or jumped on the Chinese bandwagon. This was an opportunity for India to stand up and tell the world that this is the decisions that India has taken is driven by its own interests, its interests of its people and its economic interests, which India has done very categorically. The foreign minister has been very categorical in telling the world what is how India, why India has taken the decisions it has. I just wanted to show you. I don't know you can see it. This is the newspaper today, and it says, I'll just read it out to you. You can read it in Times today. US imported more fuel from Russia than India. This is after the war started. And the next line says the European Union order surged since Moscow-Ukraine war. So, this headline sums it up. The foreign minister said India's imports of oil from Russia equal one afternoon of oil requirements in Europe. So when other powers try to tell India what to do, I think India has stood up for itself and outlined its needs more categorically than ever. Now, but we have to also deal with the rest of the world. We have to also understand how India can economically function and can have its trade ties, can also have its strategic ties with the US. Now, and one of the aspects that has been spoken about is that India's dependence on Russia has been historical. India has been in this region where it's surrounded by more enemies than allies, and Russia has been one of the consistent allies over history. That is one part. Now, if we set that aside and look at trade and economics alone, So over a period of time, and Russian weapons, Russian armaments have been have formed the bedrock of India's uh, uh, military growth over the years. However, according to SIPRI is a Stockholm-based international peace institute, which assesses the weapon supply, etc., and amongst other things. So they assess that the the Russia was the largest supplier of weapons to India over a period of time. The US emerged as the second largest supplier of weapons between 2010 and 2014. But in the last 6 years, India's arms imports have diversified rapidly. And that's what I'm coming to. The US now, I mean, after the diversification, the American imports have been 51% lower, have been halved from the time they were earlier. So, what does that indicate? I mean, reduction of American arms imports have meant that there has been hectic lobbying by companies to increase their market share here in India. The war gives them the opportunity to push for these supplies. It is here that India's diversification over a period of time will be helpful, will be useful for India. It is here that India's stress on Atmanirbharta is going to be the core of how India has a voice that is independent in future, in case certain other such dynamics were to take place which disturb the world order. It is here that better technology transfers and agreements with other European nations, such as what has happened with Russia in the past, can be explored where there are more choices available. India has already, as we speak, I mean, over the last year, 2 years, has signed up military acquisitions from other countries. They've got Scantar, 6,000 radars from Denmark, the sonar systems from Germany, naval guns from Italy, and other weapons from South Korea. So, despite all this, India still imports 50% of military requirements from Russia, over 90% of the main battle tanks, T-72s and T-90s, and the aircraft carriers, the submarines. They're all Russians. But Indians' defense imports can face implications because of the impending American sanctions. There you have India's plans of inducting the Russian S-400 missile systems, which is critical to countering Chinese threats. It's a conundrum that the US will face. And if you read the American statements in recent times, the Americans do understand, though they take a dim view of India's stand during the Ukraine war, which is fine by themselves. But in a world where countries take decisions based on the principle of self-preservation, America will know best why it supported Pakistan all these years, despite the fact that Pakistan was a supporter and hotbed of terrorism. And so therefore, strategic security imperatives will always be paramount in the decisions that a nation takes. And in this case, China, being the common adversary, it is well understood by the West, and it will be in their in their interests, in their larger interests, that India remains a critical ally. And for India to remain a critical ally and a strong weapons market, and and a growing market, otherwise, it knows that India, as a democracy and as a strong regional power, balances China very well. And in this context, in the Indo-Pacific, the US needs a strong and decisive partnership in Asia that can confront China. I believe India provides that. India is the bulwark, is the strong bulwark that provides US with that kind of an opportunity to, and also the fact that India has a good relationship with Russia also enables enables Russia to be kept at bay, or not interfere in Indo-Pacific. In India, as India grows, as India steps up to a new role, this is something that one would expect India to do in the future. And given the fact that India has taken its decisions in a very nuanced manner in the last 2-3 months, uh, time will tell, and time is already beginning to tell that India's decisions have been are going to be seen in the right light. That's where I'll end at the moment, because we can go on about what the other possibilities in Indo-Pacific would be. One of the a quick input that I'd have is one of the things that I see um, is when we look at there was a G20 meeting recently, and in that G20 meeting, half the nations, G7 nations, and G20 is again an assembly of finance ministers and economic representatives of economically consequential countries. So in that G20, influential, consequential, developed and developing countries, there is a strong influential group of developed countries, G7, which walked out because Russia, they thought, should be excluded from that group. Now, India, Indonesia, some of these other countries would, in due course, play a crucial role, especially India, in walking that tightrope, in managing these relations between an increasingly split, fractious East-West divide and North-South divide. And that's where we are as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned, where we see China, which is increasingly ambitious, but thwarted by the importance of Taiwan, a central role of India, which India comes out stronger, wherein India comes out stronger after the Ukraine war, and certain important decisions that India would need to make insofar as diversification of imports and dependence on Russia is concerned, which brings us to Atmanirbharta and the essence of India in terms of defining itself in the region very soon. Thank you.
I have a series of 3 or 4 questions, if I
Sure.
may. Some of them may be a little bit tangential to the talk, but sort of connected in some ways.
Yeah.
I'll start with Taiwan first. You seem to suggest that one of the key outcomes of the Ukraine-Russia war on the Indo-Pacific is in connection with what China is going to do with Taiwan. Not too relevant for the talk, but why is Taiwan, an invasion and integration of Taiwan, so dearly important to China? People have speculated that Ukraine has had a similar, mental model for Russia, which is probably not so. If you listen to Professor John Mearsheimer, he doesn't. He suggests that Russia is not after integrating Ukraine into Russia. But it's more a buffer state which it wants to maintain, a neutrality, which, so why is this invasion at the cost of, I don't know what consequences there might be for China if it were to invade Taiwan? Why is it so dear?
Sure. So that's a great question, Rahul. China's ambitions are deeply rooted in its history. And, in the 15th century, the Chinese followed the concept of Tianxia, which meant that China is the center of the earth, and the states around it are all vassal states, which pay them hafta, the money to protect them, protection money, etc. So over a period of time, China underwent lots of changes, and they went through a century of humiliation, as they call it, because of invasions from others, etc. So when the Communist Party came to power in 1949, they had a 100-year theory that, by 2049 they are going to be this big power. Now, when Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, if you notice, the last, in the 7 years, the number of standoffs that China has had with India is more than the number of standoffs combined in the last 4 decades before that. He has also spelled out his naval plans. He's also spelled out his expansion plans across the world, naval expansion plans. Now, connected with this, and he also sought a lifetime presidency for himself. He's very ambitious, and Xi Jinping, over a period of time, has sought to replace or be seen in the same light as Mao Zedong. One of the things that defines that is the reunification, or as they call it, the reunification of Taiwan with China. And I went back to 1958 as the time when it was an unsuccessful attempt at unifying Taiwan. Taiwan has always remained a very vulnerable, touchy, sensitive subject for Chinese over a period of time. What has also happened is, China wanted to upend India, which did not succeed in the last couple of years. There, Xi Jinping's mark sheet has to show something. He has to show that this is why I am the greatest leader that China has ever seen. And that is where Taiwan comes in. Taiwan is not, you are right there, Taiwan is not a result of an expansion. The Chinese vulnerability towards Taiwan is not a result of an expansion of American interests, unlike in Ukraine, but it is an it is a it is an expansion of their own ambitions, not someone else's interest, but their own ambitions. And their own ambitions are rooted in history, and their own ambitions are rooted in the ambition of Xi Jinping, in the personal ambition of Xi Jinping, and which is why he has also officially spoken about the unification campaign, spoken about unifying and talking about Greater China. He's talking about that. And, if you look at Hong Kong, for instance, it is very, it is not very unusual for China to go back, or it's not very unusual for Chinese leaders to go back on what they had promised earlier on having two systems, one state, two systems, Hong Kong, China. But now you see the whole unification campaign does not include Taiwan, Hong Kong, but it kind of wants. The aim is to have Hong Kong as part of the larger China thought, and Taiwan comes in terms of its the Chinese ambition to have a greater China, which is what was there in the original communist campaign, and Xi Jinping's desire to actually advance it before 2049 to somewhere in the 2020s.
Thanks. A connected question. You mentioned Taiwan is a large trading partner to the US, and it impacts US tech hegemony if Taiwan is sort of integrated with China. Why would that be so? Because China already is actually probably the number 1, 2 trading partner with US. So it just amalgamates Taiwan and becomes a bigger trading partner for US. Why does it change anything for US itself?
Yeah, well, yes and no, because what happens is you have and it's theoretically, as a theoretical construct, Taiwan were to integrate into China peacefully and become a larger supplier of and become integrated in the US economy, and also become the largest supplier of semiconductor chips. And that's a bedrock of the Taiwanese economy as well. So what happens is that if it was a peaceful campaign, if it was something that was agreed to by both sides, such as the people of East Germany and West Germany, that would have been different. In this case, there's a huge rebellion, there's a huge opposition within Taiwan. So it is not going to be a peaceful campaign. If it were one, it'd be an invasion in clear terms, and Taiwan would destroy all its facilities. So the outcome will not be the theoretical construct of a peaceful enjoining of two nations, but would be an invasion, which would result in the destruction of the facilities, which would mean the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks, and all the automobile companies, they go bust, and the whole global economy suffers. So that is what would be the unintended consequences of an invasion.
Yeah, I get it. Perhaps it was a silly question.
No. It's just kind of sort of disentangles the two, and that's why I thought of East Germany and West Germany as one of the other sort of.
Yeah, good example. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, little disconnected question. So, and this may go into a little murky area. There are astrologers and all of these people, I follow some of them just out of interest of, whether their prediction went right or wrong. And one of them particularly actually talks about a very large scale war breaking out somewhere in the 2030s, early 2030s, okay, as a result of what's growing now with the Ukraine-Russia war. Clearly speculating or predicting that the China invasion will happen of Taiwan will happen in the 2030s, and it will lead to almost a global war where China, Russia would perhaps end up becoming partners, and India is also going to get embroiled in this whole war on the side of the Quad or US or whatever. Whether that prediction is right or wrong is My question is more from the S-400 perspective.
Hmm.
China has S-400, Turkey has S-400, and India does. One of our speakers earlier, MD Nalapatji, actually warned about India not deploying S-400. And there was a talk on this topic. And then eventually there are 2 battalions being deployed now, and it's all gung-ho. But what really happens if China and Russia were to be allies and India was on the opposite side? Does that threaten India's ability to put S-400s to use? Or, I mean, can there be cyber warfare where the entire systems can be shut down? I don't know how it operates, but the first time I heard this, S-400 was ringing in my head. So it'd be great if you can share a perspective. What happens in that situation?
Sure, sure. I'll just answer this question slightly differently. I believe, when we look at, future wars, the idea is to not look at it from a limited perspective of deployment of A or B or C, but we talk about gray zone, we talk about cyber warfare, we talk about various other things. I would think that and it is also, when we're talking about the dependence, and why I spoke about why India has to move away from dependence on Russian weapon systems alone. And if we were to look at it in black and white, yes, of course, there are vulnerabilities, and that is one of the reasons why India has a relationship with Russia today, and not on the other side as a possible, you know, and as a possible theoretical sort of understanding might have us believe. So Russia is on India's side, and insofar as China is concerned, how much Russia is going to influence, and that's I said I'll answer this question slightly differently. How much Russia is able to influence after the war is can only be seen after the war ends. The jury is still out on where the war ends and how it ends, and where Russia ends on which side of the war. Um, of course, they will settle. Russia will have a part of Ukraine, but where does this leave Russia insofar as its ability to influence another war in Indo-Pacific is concerned? And where does it leave India? Where, as far as deployment of S-400s are concerned, as I said, the war is a greater zone of conflict, which involves various other aspects, and that's where you see in recent times India's focus on aligning with France, on aligning with other European countries, and the closeness, the proximity of India and Australia, India and Japan, because there is a realization that the American decline is not about if, it's about when, and that when is closer than ever. And one of the reasons why we see a very different kind of a world order, and that's why I focus on Indo-Pacific, because this is a place where I believe India, Australia, Japan, with the assistance of some of the European uh, powers such as France, which is close to India, would play an important role in countering or counterbalancing China. Of course, with the US in the background or US around, but the importance of having the allies in one. I mean, you spoke about Russia being on the other side, but there is also a talk of weaponizing Japan. I spoke about the nuclearization of Japan, possible nuclearization of Japan, changing the order here. So all of those things are possibilities that would play out. It's not that US and the Chinese and Russians are going to be on one side and the rest of the world are going to watch them grow. I think as Chinese threats increase, vulnerabilities are felt, and the nations that I spoke about in this region are going to weaponize themselves. India, whether it's diversifying its weapon supply or sort of growing its own capability to grow, uh, uh, grow strong through through Atmanirbharta, or and also aligning with others to counterbalance China in the region. We are seeing, and I spoke about surrogate conflict. I also spoke about it's early days yet, but my question to others would be: are we seeing a declining influence of China in terms of some of these countries where it has given loans, or these countries which there is where we see an upheaval of political systems, is that going to be one of the challenges that China faces in future? We speak about the challenges that America faces. We speak about the challenges that we're going to face. But there is also a set of challenges that China would face in future, and I think that could also possibly determine where we are in terms of the war capabilities of India and its allies and China and its allies.
Prabal, thanks for your very interesting perspective. I have a question. It's broadly in two parts. Firstly, the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war and the potential China-Taiwan conflict, the jus ad bellum, the legitimacy of the claims. Very briefly, can you comment about what you think about is the legitimacy of the Russian claims in Ukraine? Similarly, weighing the Chinese claims over Taiwan, and I might add the backdrop to this would be India's claims in POK, whether we act on those or not, or in Aksai Chin for that matter. Why I ask this first part, is because in a potential case of a conflict of China with Taiwan, where do you think India would then be sitting? That is, I'm premising my current stand on the fact that, we are taking a moral principled stand that Russia is a friend, but they have legitimate issues with what NATO has done to Ukraine. So, in such a future scenario, where do you think India would then be sitting? Should we take then a potential principled stand, or would we take a more Chanakyan stand? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question, Gagandeep. I think, to me, nations do take their decisions based on their interests, and it could differ from region A to region B. What happens in Ukraine is, what is good for the goose is not the same for the gander. So, what happens in Ukraine is perhaps different from what is happening here. And I think Rahul mentioned this a little while earlier, and I just reiterate that earlier point that, in Ukraine, I think, and this is again, who is right anyway is determined by how much might one possesses. And in Ukraine, it's a combination of the threat Russia possibly perceived to have faced from the NATO expansion, combined with Putin's ambitions, combined with the entire thought of a greater Russia. So I think there was also, it is a recent phenomena. It is a recent phenomena. I say that because USSR was dismantled, and you had Ukraine and Russia and Putin's ambitions and other things. There are a whole lot of things, which was exacerbated by the expansion of NATO in the region. That is one. In this case, it is more organic. It is not based on someone moving somewhere into Taiwan or close to Taiwan, or US having some bases. No, US can have bases, but China's never. That's not the core of China's thrust. China's thrust it comes out of its own desire to, its historical desire to correct a wrong, which they feel that it should be part of China. It's not a part of China. So that is where it comes from, as far as China is concerned. What should India do? I think India, in the last couple of months, India has positioned itself as somebody who takes its own decisions, irrespective of how or what the superpower thinks, or how it should be in terms of a particular situation. It's just determined by its own interests. So therefore, I would think India, in this case, in this region, given the fact that a possible invasion by China into Taiwan also sets the template, or sets a precedent for possible Chinese adventurism in the, as China calls it, the five fingers: Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, so Arunachal. So India ought to see it as an unfurling of Chinese plans, and that invasion is something that India can, in my opinion, if India were to grow as a regional power, if India were to stamp itself as a regional power, that is an opportunity for India to step up and align with Japan and the others. For far too long, I think we have sometimes been balked by the Chinese ghost. It's important that India, if it wants to grow as a regional power and show itself as a regional power, it needs to, because it's happening to Taiwan does not mean that India if India were to keep quiet, there wouldn't be anybody at your door tomorrow. So I think that is number one. Number two, if India were to have a voice in the region, this is where it would be. This is where it can actually be unambiguously speaking up for itself and the region, and for itself as a leader in the region. In Ukraine, India has had its interest in. And to your question, Gagandeep, one of the things that happens here is that this is far less complex than Ukraine. In Ukraine, for India to take a call, there was a complex set of issues. In so far as Taiwan is concerned, it's far clearer on which side India would be. It's far clearer which side of Quad India is in. And as I've seen in the last few months, this hectic parleys with Japan, with Australia and France only indicate that India is possibly setting itself up to play a far more active role in the region. In what way, to what extent, to what degree, we don't know. But I think it would only be right for India to step up from where it is right now and participate if there were to be any kind of action in Taiwan. Yeah.
Recently, we witnessed France elections. So in France, there were allegations of Russian interference in Le Pen's supporting. So do you think Russia would support Le Pen, and why would Russia support Le Pen and not support Macron?
Russia, as far as European powers go, as far as European governments go, is predominantly at this point, as we speak, is opposed to the actions or the decisions of the European governments and European leaders. So the existing European leaders would always be found to be on the other side as far as Russia is concerned, and therefore it would only be in Russia's interest if the leadership changes in countries, and the leadership changes in France too. So I would think that to be the case. I don't have information around how Russia would have influenced Le Pen's campaign, so I can't comment on that. But I would think that, given the fact that European leaders have opposed Russia in Ukraine, the leadership of Russia would like to see a change in the governments in Europe, and try and see if there are governments that are in their favor. Technically, they would want to do that, but whether they're doing that or not, I can't really comment on it at this point. And a quick addition, sorry, to Gagandeep's earlier point, I just remembered you spoke about the POK as well. So I think, I said, what is right is determined by, the might that you have. I think we can go into another discussion on what the Chinese proposal of 1959 line, etc. was, and where we are on that. But I think, in practical terms, I don't think that given that, part of POK is also, the Chinese have taken land from Pakistan, and also the Aksai Chin question has been far gone. I mean, for far too long. We have a country that has got its own complexities and complications, and India as a country has several issues to deal with internally as well as externally. Would we want to have another set of land and another set of complexities with us? Is a big question we should ask ourselves. I don't think so.
Minister of External Affairs, India needs to put behind the idea that it needs to get approval from other nations on how it engages with the world on the basis of who we are, rather than try and please the world. And the speaker also made a statement, that India is taking a very firm stand these days. Now, in view of this, my point is that the US is already, this is how I feel, is already trying to arm twist India. They sent their diplomats. There was an Indian-American diplomat. There was a lady, and now the intellectuals are writing a large number of Indian-American professionals writing letters saying that a lot of oppression, suppression of minorities in India, and so on and so forth. I feel US is already trying to put India in its shoes. I don't know how would be the future Indo-US relations. Even Subramania Swamy had slightly a different take on this. So I would request you to kindly comment.
Yeah, No, thank you, Karnik-ji. I think there is the if we look at the Indo-US relations, there are two tracks that go alongside each other. One is the theoretical track, and one is the pragmatic part. And you'll always see, there's an immediate US reaction to an Indian decision which was there, and post the Russia-Ukraine war when it happened. And that has been, you would find think tanks in the US protesting. You might find people writing against India. But and as I said a certain time ago, that in the 1980s, the US supported Pakistan because they needed Pakistan as a counter against terrorism. Whether it was right or wrong, I'm not going to go into that. But that is a theory the US adopted that time because it was in their interest. It was in their interest that they continue to supply weapons. They continue to have relations with Pakistan. In the same light, if I were to look at, I wouldn't compare. It's not analogous, but looking at it from an American point of view, India has taken a stand based on its set of interests, which determine its security and its political requirements and its economic requirements in the region. So that is how India, and as I said, India is surrounded by different kinds of neighbors, and India is not surrounded by too many allies. One of the most consistent allies has been Russia, and India has been very, very categorical in spelling that out. To your point, in terms of a US diplomat coming in, lecturing India on how India should behave and what India should do. Well, I think they have their right to do that. India has its right to speak. And I think over a period of time, I've written somewhere as well in one of the columns that America, though it speaks about lots of things, it is also one of the good things about America is its actions are determined by its own pragmatic interests. If I were to look at it from the American prism, in the Indo-Pacific, the Americans cannot really do without India as much as India cannot do without America. That's the pragmatic track I was talking about. The theoretical track can be, people writing and speaking, and that they have their right to do so. But the pragmatic track is, what are we doing about it? The American weapons market, and I spoke about how the American weapons market is lobbying hectically, and they want to have a share of it. They don't want to let go of that. The American political interests are there in this region. The Indian political interests are also aligned with America. The Quad is also aligned here. So there are common interests and there are areas of criticism. But whether the interests of criticism, the areas of criticism outweigh the interests or not, will determine the way forward. Right now and in the long run, the interests outweigh the areas of differences and criticism. Americans, individuals, think tanks, diplomats, they might always have their opinions. But does America believe in going that way in the Indo-Pacific without India? I don't think so, and I don't think any American leader, in its own right, in his right sense, would think it that way. I think that will continue to happen. But and as far as India is concerned, one of the more pragmatic stands is the diversification of its alignment with various nations. And as I said, it is therefore very crucial that the nations that are proximate to the geography, which is where Japan comes in, which is where India, South Korea, and you see all these nations are not aligned with China, and where Philippines, some of these other nations. Today we see some of these. So these Australia. So these nations are going to play an important role, and America, well, it does understand India's decisions today. I think if you look at a timeline, February 2022, American comments, March 22 in American comments, April 22 in American comments. If I were to just put it on a timeline, you will see a reasonable sort of tempering of American comments on India's decisions. And I think it's a greater understanding of Indian decisions in the light of its own interests globally that America sees and will continue to see.
The world has seen, when I say world, especially those countries who have been relying on America and the Western Bloc, whether it is Taiwan or it is Japan or Australia, they have noticed in recent years that America may be a very good friend. The NATO may be a very powerful bloc and a friendly bloc, but unfortunately, they are not such blocs on whom these countries can rely exclusively. They having them as friends is very good, but the way America runs away suddenly from Afghanistan, leaving everybody in lurch, including all their equipment and all other resources. They did it long ago in Vietnam. So this raises a question that it's really good to have America as a friend. It's good to have relations with NATO, whether it is India or Taiwan or Japan or Vietnam or countries like Australia and Philippines. This block of countries has, because of their geographic position and because of the commonality of China as a very potential adversary and a threat. Do you think there is a need now for these countries bloc to think a bit independently also, or without disturbing the relations or without leaving relations with America, with NATO, Western Bloc? These countries need an independent bloc, which, if the situation needs, can function with or without the help of America and NATO and other Western allies. Because what Russia has done to Ukraine, everybody has seen that the first people to run away were those who were on whom Ukraine relied very much.
Yeah.
And today, whatever we say, Ukraine is destroyed. Ukraine will take at least, if not more decades, at least 1 decade to come back to its own position. So these countries I'm talking about need to be a bloc, a friendly bloc, and a common cause platform they need to have. Would you please comment on that?
Sure. I do think there is also an understanding, and I partly sort of answered this, that there is also an understanding of relative decline in American hegemony and American influence in the region. There is also a creeping wariness, and a very strong one, of the rise of China, and which is a fact of life, which is there. Now, given the rise of China, do we need America? Yes. Should we be dependent on America? Completely no, given the past record. America certainly is a strong power that is needed. But and to your point, I think there is also coming together of nations, and that's where you see people wanting greater power. That's why you see Japan wanting to become nuclearized, change its security sort of rationale, which it was wedded to since the Second World War. Taiwan wants a security guarantee today because the US could not protect its interest in Afghanistan. The US and NATO could not really help Ukraine, despite the various sanctions on Russia, etc., it's a separate subject. But it could not protect, like you rightly said, Ukraine got destroyed. Will it happen to Taiwan? We answered that. We spoke about it. Should nations come together? I think this is a time where the world security paradigm needs to be redefined in certain senses. Second World War meant that Germany should not have a weaponized force, that Japan should not have a weaponized force. Do we have the same leadership in Germany and Japan today? No. Then why should we have the thinking wedded to the Second World War, where Japan and Germany had those ambitions, and therefore the scaling of the militaries was the militaries or military growth subsequently was scaled down. Today we have a very different world. We have a benign Japan and a benign Germany, but a benign Japan is threatened by an advancing China. So if I were to deconstruct your question, that, yes, given the rise of China and the threat to the region, there is a need for these nations, which in the light of Second World War were actually scaled down insofar as their military growth was concerned. Now they need to invest in military growth, and they need to be strong. And I think in this region, except for India, and I go back to the previous question that except for India, there are no others who can actually at that level who can counter China. There are other countries, but militarily, and China is aware of that India is one ally the US has, or the West has, or the world has in this region that can counterbalance the growth of China along with the other nations. And I think that is where the importance of having nations which can really form a committee of a group that can influence the region, despite the fact that US is sometimes there, sometimes not there. That is important, and that's why I spoke about the proximate aspect of Japan, India, South Korea. It's important that Indo-Pacific is also run geopolitically by these nations, which are democracies. And that's why I talk about democracy here, which are democracies, which are benign, which do not have such kind of militaristic ambitions, and which can also counterbalance the imminent rise of China in the region. Thank you.